All right, so we have one more lecture that's going to be graphic, and so I want to warn you in advance. We're continuing our discussion of the phenomena of lynching. And I want to repeat that the reason I go into details is because they're important. Because there's a denial about how bad racism is. There's a false sense of security that essentially this country is a civilized country, that we don't engage in atrocities like we saw in Nazi Germany, etc. And I think that's a dangerous assumption. And we've seen individualized outbreaks. And I mentioned in the 1990s, the murder of James Byrd, an African-American man, Jasper, Texas, and the murder of Matthew Shepard, a gay college student in Wyoming. Both of those happened in the 1990s. Violence, atrocities committed against Muslims because of September 11th. We need to not be complacent. And we need to be aware that this is part of the pathology of our culture, so we can honestly face it and root it out. So, in that spirit, we're going to talk about 5 particular instances of lynchings. And I'm going to read newspaper accounts. And they're going to get graphic sometimes, they're going to get detailed. But there are specific things I want you to notice about these incidents. I want you to notice, number one, since I'm going to draw on media accounts in the time, what role does the press play in these events? Are they the honest recorders of events? Do they facilitate this? Are they enablers? I want you to note how many people participate. I want you to note the attitudes of the people engaged in these behaviors. I want you to notice how many people in positions of authority, power, allowed this to happen. And I want you to think about this, because we're going to talk about this when we talk about critics of lynching. I want you to think about what the message is, who is that message aimed at, and this may be surprising. Lynching is obviously about race, but I want you to begin to think about, before we discuss it, what lynching might have to do with the politics of gender, because that's involved too. So we will start, and I noted this before, but lynchings often involve mobs numbering in the thousands. And I noted that killing the African-American victim was often not enough. Elaborate torture often preceded death. And although white Southerners tried to portray these events as spontaneous acts of rage, these people, the mobs have discovered that a innocent victim has been raped and murdered, assaulted in some terrible way. And they're not even thinking, they're unconscious, they're just seized by a sense of justice denied, rights trampled on, and so they act spontaneously without thinking. And I think that these newspaper accounts indicate what a lie that is. This is cold, this is calculated, it's political. And so the last thing I want you to think about is, what is the political message that's being sent? We see all this in the October 27th, 1934 mob murder of Claude Neal, a farmhand in Marianna, Florida. And when we read this account, I just want to note that date, 1934. At this point, both of my parents are alive. My father was 6, my mother was 2. That seems disturbingly close to my lifetime. So plans for this particular lynching were actually announced in advance by a local newspaper. This is not spontaneous. In fact, it was publicized. So in the Macon Telegraph, that's a Georgia newspaper, October 26, 1934, please note the wording and the tone in all these newspaper stories. Big preparation made for lynching tonight. Local citizens have been preparing all day for the lynching of a Negro scheduled to take place here tonight. This morning, a mob seized Claude Neal, 23, note the age, from a jail in Bruton, Alabama, where he had been held in connection with the murder of a white girl, which took place here several days ago. He's in a jail cell. When you're in a jail cell, they lock you up. There's a cell door that's locked. If a mob seized him, what had to have happened? The jailers, the people responsible for keeping him detained, but also protecting the prisoner, had to have opened the door. Had to have let the mob carry him away. Had to have not followed the mob. Had to have not ordered them to stop. Had to have not used their weapons to gain control of the situation and fire a weapon in, gun in the air, something to stop a crime in the process of taking place. They allowed it to happen. This next paragraph always startles me. Every time I read it, chills go down my neck and back. I want you to think about what this is saying. At noon, a committee of 6 representing the mob announced a timetable for the lynching, which was given in newspapers and over the radio as follows. First of all, let's think about this. A mob with a committee. How many mobs have committees? By definition, a mob is not organized. Secondly, they've written a press release. It's appeared here in the newspaper, the Macon Telegraph. They're reading on the radio, and I want you to picture yourself, they didn't have car radios then, but imagine driving in your car with a car radio on, and someone's announcing, we're going to murder someone tonight. Here's where it's located, and here's the order in which we're going to torture this person before we kill him. That's a society that existed in the United States in 1934, less than 100 years ago. At sundown, this is the announcement. This is basically the press release from the Committee of 6 for the mob. At sundown, the Negro will be taken to the farm 2 miles from here where Miss Lola Kennedy, the murder victim, lived. There he will be mutilated by the girl's father, announced in advance. Then he will be brought to a pig pen in the middle of a cotton field nearby where the girl's body was found and killed. Finally, his body will be brought to Marianna, the county seat 9 miles from here, and hung in the courthouse square for all to see. The Negro is presently being held at undisclosed location in a swamp along the Chattahoochee River, not far from the Kennedy River. Do you think they know where he is? Of course they do. This isn't people, across the community are participating. This is known. The police are not rescuing this person who's going to be the victim of a murder. And listen, please, to the tone of the next paragraph. Again, this is in the statement the Committee of 6 issued to the newspaper and to the radio stations. Quote, all white folks are invited to the party, said the announcement issued by the mob's Committee of 6. I don't know if you've ever been around someone who's experienced a tragic death, families who have lost loved ones. But after events like that, if you're in grieving, mourning, you generally don't speak of parties. I would say that the tone of this is jovial. This is not a group of people who are truly mourning the death of a child, but looking forward to the violence and the victimization of an African American man. This is not consistent with my experience with grief, personal and of other people. As a result, thousands of citizens have been congregating all afternoon at the Kennedy farm. Bonfires have been started. Piles of sharp sticks have been prepared. Knives have been sharpened, and one woman has displayed a curry comb. By the way, that's a metal device used to remove dirt from a horse's coat, with which she promises to torture the Negro. The crowd is said to have been addressed by a member of the Florida State Legislature who, in a humorous vein, promised that no one would be disappointed if the crowd maintained decorum. An elected official is at the scene where a murder is going to take place. And it's been announced in advance that there's going to be torture. A member of a state legislature, the Florida State Legislature, is telling jokes to the crowd. He's not telling them, we have a legal system here where you get arrested, you have the right to an attorney, you have a trial by your peers, and then if you're found guilty, then you're punished. or if you're found not guilty, you're released. He's not saying that. He said, just behave yourself while you torture and kill this man. Some misgivings are said to have been expressed by the committee over the fact that the crowd is heavily armed and highly intoxicated. It is feared that shots aimed at the Negro may go astray and injure innocent bystanders, who include some women with babes in arms. And this is really incredible. There's a book when I do this lecture face-to-face in class. I give students the option to look at this book that's called Without Sanctuary. This man named James Allen had made a gruesome discovery. He used to go to estate sales. Estate sales are when someone dies, their survivors sell what that person accumulated in their lifetime. By the way, I organized an estate sale for my mom when she passed away. A lot of you don't know this yet, but you'll find this when your older relatives pass away. People accumulate an unbelievable amount of crap in their lifetime. Stuff you're not going to want to keep. And he was going to these estate sales across the South, and he found something. A photograph of the lynching, kept as a keepsake. He was shocked by that, and he saw it as an historical artifact. He wanted to make sure that was preserved, so he bought it. And then he went to other estate sales in the South, and he began seeing other lynching photographs. So he began to make this a mission of his. And it's extraordinary. People will take these photographs, and one of the many, many appalling things about this, they would make them into postcards that the United States Postal Service would deliver. There's one of the lynching in downtown Dallas, a man named Alan Brooks, who was accused of raping a 3-year-old white child, an African-American man accused of that. He's on trial in the Dallas courthouse. The trial literally has just started. They've just picked the jury. No testimony has been given yet. There's a mob outside the courthouse. Basically, they're on the streets, and then they break into the courtroom. They tie a noose around his neck. They throw the other end of a very long rope to the street below. They yank the rope. He tumbles to the street several stories down, dies from that, obviously. He's tied up to a car, and then he's hung from an arch. Someone took a photograph. And in this collection of photos that was published as a book, it was on Art Exhibit 2, someone writes, "Here's the party I was at," on the postcard with the picture of the lynching in downtown Dallas. I've seen other postcards where there's a burnt corpse, a black man who had been hanged and burned. And someone circled, said, "This is the barbecue I was at." Literally, those are the words. People circling their faces and saying, "Here I am at this event." And in many of these photos, and the reason I brought up this story, there's a reference to women with babes in arms. Children are brought to these events. Fathers lift their sons on their shoulders so they can get a better look to see this spectacle of murder. So the last paragraph in the story. During the early afternoon, a party of men broke off from the crowd at the Kennedy farm. They paid a visit to the cabin where Neil's family lives and burned it to the ground. So any pretense that this is a gentleman outrage of a crime and they're punishing the wrongdoer, they're punishing the entire family. In a case where there's no due process, no evidence has been presented, no witnesses, and the execution is carried out without any chance at defense on the part of Mr. Neil. Now, this is where it gets really bad. This is going to be the worst and most gruesome of these stories. Please be aware of that. And again, think about why they're doing these things. And who are they communicating with? And why is it so insanely over the top? And what kind of people? I mean, the thing is, and we'll talk about this later, These aren't the villains in horror films. These are shopkeepers, barbers, people who are street sweepers, people who work at a grocery store, people who work at the fire department, people who go to church every Sunday, people who bring soup to the family next door when the child is sick. And then they gather together, they do these things. And I want you to think about this. Black people had to, after events like this happened, had to resume their lives surrounded by the people who did these things, not knowing if they would be next. And they had to live every day surrounded by people they know are butchers. So note the headline, Birmingham Post, October 27th, 1934. Please note the tone of the headline, because I think this reveals more than the headline writer suspected. Lynching carried off almost as advertised. The previous story was an ad promoting the event. That's the function that newspapers are playing in these tragedies. The body of Claude Neal, 23, confessed attacker and slayer of a white girl, swung from a tree on the courthouse lawn here today, the victim of an enraged mob's vengeance. Now, you might ask yourself, how they get the confession? I guarantee you there were no Miranda rights. We've talked about those before. They tortured him. And when you're tortured, you'll tell the torturer what he wants to hear. A crowd of 100 men, women, and children silently gazed at the body, nude except for a sack reaching from the waist to the knee. The Negro had been shot at least 50 times, burned with red-hot irons, and dragged through the streets behind an automobile. An eyewitness to the lynching, which took place yesterday, said that Neal had been forced to mutilate himself before he died. The eyewitness gave the following account of the event, which took place in the swamp besides the Chattahoochee River. This is a quote. This is where the most horrible stuff we'll hear all semester is going to be. And there's also the N-word, so just be aware of that. This is the witness to the event. Quote, due to the large number of people who wanted to lynch the nigger, it was decided to do away with him first and bring him to the Kennedy House dead. First, they cut off his penis. He was made to eat it. Then they cut off his testicles and made him eat them and say that he liked it. Then they sliced his sides and stomach with knives, and every now and then someone would cut off a finger or a toe. Red-hot irons were used on the nigger to burn him from top to bottom. From time to time during the torture, a rope would be tied around Neal's neck, and he was pulled over the limb and held there until he almost choked to death. Then he would be let down and the torture begun all over again. After several hours of this punishment, so imagine that, this is going on for hours, they decided just to kill him. Neal's body was tied to a rope on the rear of an automobile and dragged over the highway to the Kennedy home. Listen to these numbers. A mob estimated in numbers somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people from 11 southern states, every former Confederate state, was excitedly awaiting his arrival. When the car which was dragging Neal's body came in front of the Kennedy home, a man who was riding the rear bumper cut the rope. A woman came out of the Kennedy house and drove a butcher knife into his heart. Then the crowd came by and some kicked him and some drove their cars over him. What remained of the body was brought by the mob to Mariana, where it is now hanging from a tree on the northeast corner of the courthouse square. Photographers say they will have soon bodies of the pictures of the body for sale at 50 cents each. Fingers and toes from Neal's body are freely exhibited on street corners here. People kept souvenirs. Presumably became heirlooms. Neal is said to have confessed in attacking and killing the white girl when he's first brought to the jail. Note the last word for safekeeping. In the Hose and Neal cases, at least, serious crimes, rape and murder were alleged. And here's the key. More often, however, lynching victims were murdered for violating some trivial rule of racial etiquette. Remember, rape is only alleged 19.2% of all lynching cases. That had always been the excuse for lynching. Most often, the lynching is a result of the violation of some carefully guarded racial boundary. And of course, sexual boundaries are very strictly enforced. And I want to suggest, I mentioned an East Texas case where a black man was burned alive for having a consensual relationship with a white woman. I want you to think about this. This is one important way in which lynching is not just about race, it's about gender. White men had used black women's bodies as battlegrounds on which they fought against black men to assert their absolute power over black men. White men had been raping black women in the British colonies and then in the United States since the first slave ship arrived in Virginia in 1619 in the original 13 colonies. That's the first slave ship to arrive in the original 13 British colonies. And had done so basically with total impunity. However, black men are going to be murdered not just for having consensual sex with white women, but for looking into their eyes, speaking to them without being spoken to first, accidentally brushing against them, or acting in any way that white men and women perceive as flirtatious. We see this dynamic in this following account. It's a Philadelphia Inquirer, January 3rd, 1916. Blacks lynched for a remark which may have been hello. This is going to be a case in South Carolina. 2 Negroes were lynched and a Negro woman was badly beaten as the result of a remark to a white girl in Anderson County, South Carolina, according to reports received here tonight. The 3 Negroes were riding in a buggy when they passed the girl. One of the men made a remark to the white girl at which she took offense. She reported the encounter to a group of white men who quickly caught up with the blacks, lynched the men, beat the woman. Note that because white men like to present themselves as gentlemen, and ordered her out of the state. Reports concerning the nature of the allegedly insulting remark are conflicting. Officials of Georgia County say that one of the Negro men yelled out, "Hello, sweetheart." The Negro woman asserts all they said was hello. That's assumed that he said hello, sweetheart. For black men, something like that could be a capital offense for which you could be executed. I would like to think that that was at least deep early in the 20th century, at least 100 years ago. But it's not. We see this with the case, the savage beating death of a 14-year-old African-American boy named Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi, August 28, 1955. That's basically 4 months before my wife was born. So it's getting really close in time, these acts. So that event is going to horrify much of the world. It's going to mobilize the civil rights movement in the second half of the 1950s. A Chicago native, Emmett Till, travels south to visit his extended family in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. 1 week into his trip, he and several of his friends are standing outside of a white-owned grocery store in the tiny town of Money. And Till tells his unbelieving friends that he has several white friends up in Chicago. He's a little kid. He's bragging. He's 14. And he also says, I have white girlfriends, and they don't believe him. So the friends are making fun of each other. They say, why don't you go talk to that white girl inside that store? It's a white woman named Carolyn Bryant, who is at the cash register. Her husband owns the store. Accounts are going to conflict on what happened next. Some claim he whistled at Bryant, Emmett Till. Others say he reached for her hands and asked her out. Another version said he said, "Bye, baby," when he left. Maybe something even more innocent than that occurred. All that is innocent. But what happens a few days later, the cashier's husband, 3 days later, is going to return, Roy Bryant. And Roy Bryant, it turns out, is an abusive husband, a wife beater. And when he hears this story from Carolyn Bryant, that supposedly she's been flirted with by a 14-year-old boy, he's enraged and he says, "I'm going to teach that boy a lesson." So just after midnight, August 28th, 1955, Bryant and his stepbrother, J.W. Milam, arrived at the home of Moses Wright, where Till had been staying. They threw Till in the back of a pickup truck, drove him to nearby Sunflower County, and they beat him till his face was unrecognizable. And I'll tell you when we get to that part of the story. And then they shoot him. Tying a 70-pound weight to his body, Bryant and Milam throw Till's body into the Tallahatchie River. 3 days later, his bloated body floats up to the surface, and authorities arrest Bryant and Milam. Now, they ship the body to Chicago, and his mother, Mamie Till Bryant, wanted the body there for the funeral. And it's remarkable. She sees her son's mutilated face, and she makes a hard decision. So we're going to have an open casket funeral. And photographers are going to be at the funeral. They're going to take pictures of Till in his casket. His face is visible, and I've seen it, and his face is about this wide. It's flat as a pancake. It's going to shock viewers around the world. And this is published in mainstream magazines. And people finally get to see the face of this ugliness. It appears in Jet, an African-American-owned magazine, but it appears everywhere. So, in spite of the fact that Moses Wright, the uncle, in the trial is going to stand up and point to the defendants, say they're the ones who kidnapped Emmett. An all-white jury is going to take a little more than an hour to acquit the defendants. Bryant and Milam are protected from further prosecution for Till's murder because of the constitutional ban on double jeopardy. You cannot be put on trial for the same crime more than once if you've been found not guilty. At that point, there are no federal civil rights laws under which they could be prosecuted. They admit to an interviewer for Look magazine that they killed Till. And they get paid, by the way, $4,000 for their interview. Now, that's 1955. A couple more cases. We're almost done. The year 1919 became one of the worst in U.S. history in terms of racial violence committed by whites against African Americans. The summer of that year became known as the Red Summer. I've referred to this before. Black blood is shed all over the country in race riots and lynchings. And a lot of times this is because black veterans who just fought for their country return home in an atmosphere where whites are enraged that African Americans are now living outside of the South in northern cities that had been almost entirely white before. They're working at jobs that white people held. And something about the sight of black men in military uniforms enrages a lot of whites. Just like when Obama becomes president and many white racists can't tolerate the idea that a black man could be president of the country, that he must be an illegal alien of some sort. They make up these ridiculous lies about his birthplace. The same thing, same kind of impulse, rage at the idea that a black man would wear a uniform of authority makes white racists' blood boil. 6 million African Americans, by the way, had moved into the North, the Midwest, and the West, as starting in 1915, before the U.S. is involved in the war as part of the Great Migration. It becomes an ugly summer that summer of 1919, which is also a time of recession. The U.S. economy sinks because wartime production stops, production of weapons and other goods of war. And this sets off lynchings. So we see this is going to be reported, and the tone of these stories is different when it's in an African-American published newspaper. This is true of the Chicago Defender, a black-owned newspaper. April 5th, 1919, Negro veteran lynched, and they use the word doff. Doff means to remove, for refusing to doff uniform. When Private William Little, a Negro returning from the war, arrived at the railroad station here several weeks ago, he was encountered by a band of whites. The whites ordered him to doff his army uniform and walk home in his underwear. Several other whites prevailed upon the hoodlums to leave Little alone, and he was permitted to walk home unmolested. Let me hit the pause button there. In Georgia, in 1919, white people are seeing a black soldier being bullied. And these group of white Southern men tell these bullies to stop. So I want you to think about this, because very often we talk about this like with slavery. People say about slave owners, well, those were the times. People didn't know better. That was commonplace. People didn't have the consciousness we had then. I always say this, though. It's interesting that when white men felt they were being persecuted by the British government, what did they call themselves? They said they were being treated like slaves. They knew slavery was a bad thing. They didn't want to be treated like slaves. That was a sign that they were stripped of dignity, the rights they were deserved. And they all through the American Revolution, that's how white people referred to themselves, because they were being asked to pay taxes. We have white men prevailing upon people to leave a black veteran who served his country alone. If these white men in the South at this one incident knew this behavior was evil and wrong, no one has an excuse in that era. No one has an excuse for homophobia today. No one has an excuse for anti-immigrant racism. No one has an excuse to bully Chinese people because of the virus that's spreading around, or to call the disease the Chinese virus, because we know that's racist. You don't have the excuse. If one person knows it's bad, everyone should be able to know it's bad. Little continued to wear his uniform over the next few weeks as he had no other clothing. Anonymous notes were sent warning him not to wear his army uniform, quote, too long, and advising him to leave town if he wished to, quote, sport around in khaki. Little ignored the notes. Khaki, by the way, is the color of military uniforms. Yesterday, Private Little was found dead on the outskirts of the city, apparently beaten by a mob. He was wearing his army uniform. Think about that next Veterans Day. Lynch mobs also murdered African Americans for simply refusing to be humiliated, especially if the African American had been successful and even achieved more than his white neighbors, because again, that undermines the entire premise of white supremacy. We see this in one last news story. This will be the last one we read. Knoxville, East Tennessee News, February 3rd, 1921. Lynched after refusing to dance on white's command. Camilla, Georgia. Jim Rowland, Negro, was lynched near here after shooting Jason I. Harville, a white man, who held a pistol on him and ordered him to dance. Both men, note the phrase here, were well-to-do farmers, and I think that's the issue. An African American is not supposed to be well-to-do. Each was standing with friends of his own race in front of a country store. Harville pulled out a gun and ordered the colored man to dance for the amusement of himself and his white friends. Rowland grabbed for the gun and it went off, killing Harville. Rowland fled, but soon was found by a posse which riddled him with bullets. Before doing so, the posse leader commanded Rowland to dance. He refused. You can die for simply refusing to be humiliated. As I said before, what's terrifying about these lynchings is so many of these people who participated in their day-to-day lives were not Charles Manson. They were not the serial killers we see in horror movies or in news stories. They are simply everyday citizens who play with their children, who love their families, and then as a group become monsters. And it is the burden of African Americans to have to live in a community not knowing which white face in the crowd will be part of a lynch mob at some point. What is this about? Well, there's a lot to disentangle here, but in the end, lynching is an act of terrorism. And terrorism has a purpose. Terrorists have an objective. They want to make a group of people feel just powerless. And by definition, I mean, they call it terrorism because they want their targets to feel terror, and they want to make those targets just be willing to do anything to stop the terror and to make it go away so they can feel safe again. It works if it's random. You don't know if you're working in the World Trade Center, if a plane's going to fly into your office space. You don't know if you go to a church worshiping and someone you've never seen before is carrying a gun and they begin mowing you down with bullets. They want you to feel safe nowhere, so you will give up. And if you could do something to feel safe, then the terrorism would be less effective. So I want to suggest this. If whites can get away with public torture and with murdering black people for the most trivial reasons, here's what the real message is. You better not even think about voting, running for office, or voicing your opinion on political matters. If we will kill you, and get away with it, by the way, because everyone will enable us, for saying hello, what do you think we're going to do if we say, hey, be sure you pay your poll tax and show up and vote? What if we assert our right to run for office? What if we refuse to obey the segregation laws? We're going to sit at this lunch counter, no matter what the sign says. And I want you to think about this, because we talk about heroism, and we always put in context usually of military, people, soldiers fighting in battles, firefighters racing into burning buildings. We talk about police officers protecting the lives of someone. We talk about that as heroism. Just the act of going out in public for African Americans for much of the time of American history has been an act of heroism. And for African Americans to witness these public murders, and they go ahead and they protest, they march, they cross the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they sit down at lunch counters, they go on buses that are segregated and sit in what's supposed to be whites-only seating. Imagine the courage of that. How many things in your life would you be willing to risk these penalties? Not just for your benefit, but for the benefit of millions. How many of you would risk that kind of torture and death? I think these are heroes that are unsung, and I can't emphasize enough the bravery of the average black person in this era. And what are they frightened of, whites? We've already said how the populist movement was an example of a leftist movement that sought to achieve economic justice, and black and white people participated. They wanted to terrify African Americans in particular, because African Americans always been critical to every freedom movement. And if poor whites and blacks joined together, African Americans reached across and found white allies, and white allies were willing to do this, then revolution would take place. And here's the other audience. I think it is white people too. I think they're trying to frighten white people from forming those alliances. So, we will talk a little bit more about that, the motives of lynching, and I think something maybe a little more uplifting, because this is terribly sad, heartbreaking. We'll talk about the people who dared to speak out about lynching next time. Thank you.